Happy Thursday, everybody. I hope you guys are all okay. It's warm, isn't it? And I'm recording this and it's a 9:30 and it is already stupidly warm. So I hope you know how much I love you guys, because I've actually turned off the fan to record this because it was too loud to do both at the same time. So that is how much I appreciate you. So we finished the London Eye mystery yesterday, and hopefully some of you guys are going to be quizzing on that today. Did you guess the ending? Did you guess what was going to happen? Now, if you did enjoy that, there is another one. It's a sequel called The Guggenheim Museum, but it's actually written by Robin Stevens, who is a different author who's done all the Murder Most and Ladylike books. But if you fancy it, that one is about the Guggenheim Museum is where Salem's auntie works, and a painting goes missing, and they think that this isn't a spoiler, by the way, it says it on the back of the book. They think that Aunt Gloria has actually stolen the painting. So Ted ends up going over to help, and Kat, to see if they can solve that crime. So if you fancy another outing with those guys, then it's called The Guggenheim Mystery. And if you want a recommendation, Persephone has just quizzed on it and she's got 10 out of 10. So if you want to know whether it's any good, probably best to speak to her. Now, we've only got a couple more weeks to think about, so we didn't quite know what book to go for next. So we've decided that we are going to do some short stories, because there's nothing worse than having to stop midway through a book. So the first one that we're going to read is called The Giant's Necklace, and it is by Michael Morpurgo. So for those of you who enjoyed Kensuke's Kingdom, it's by the same author. I know that Austin has read about 10 of his in a row, so hopefully he'll enjoy it. The Giant's Necklace by Michael Morpurgo. The necklace stretched from one end of the kitchen table to the other, around the sugar bowl at the far end and back again, stopping only a few inches short of the toaster. The discovery on the beach of a length of abandoned fishing line draped with seaweed had first suggested the idea to Cherry. So Cherry is a person, by the way. It's got a capital C. Had first suggested the idea to Cherry, and every day of the holiday since then had been spent in one single-minded pursuit, the creation of a necklace of glistening pink shells. She had sworn to herself and to everyone else that the necklace would not be complete until it reached the toaster, and when Cherry vowed she would do something, she invariably did it. Cherry was the youngest in a family of older brothers, 4 of them, who had teased her relentlessly since the day she was born 11 years ago. She referred to them as the 4 mistakes, for it was a family joke that each son had been an attempt to produce a daughter. To their huge delight, Cherry reacted passionately to any slight or insult, whether intended or not. Their particular targets were her size, which was diminutive, which means smaller, compared with theirs, and her dark, flashing eyes that could wither with one scornful look. Her zapping look, they called it. Although the teasing was ongoing, it was rarely hurtful, nor was it intended to be, for her brothers adored her, and she knew it. Cherry was poring over her necklace, still in her dressing gown. Breakfast had just been cleared away, and she was alone with her mother. She fingered the shells lightly, turning them gently until the entire necklace lay flat, with the rounded pink of the shells all uppermost. Then she bent down and breathed on them in turn, polishing them carefully with a napkin. "There's still sea in them," she said to no one in particular. "You can still smell it, and I washed them, you know." "You've only got today, Cherry," said her mother, coming over to the table and putting an arm round her. "Just today, that's all. We're off back home tomorrow morning, first thing." "Why don't you call it a day, dear? You've been at it every day. You must be tired of it by now." "There's no need to go on, you know. We all think it's a fine necklace, and quite long enough. It's long enough, surely." Cherry shook her head slowly. "No," she said, "only that little bit left to do, and then I'll be finished." "But they'll take hours to collect, dear," her mother said weakly, recognising and at the same time respecting her daughter's persistence. "Only a few hours," said Cherry, bending over, her brows critically inspecting, her brows furrowing critically as she has inspected a flaw in one of the shells. "That's all it'll take. Do you know there are 5,325 shells in my necklace already? I counted them, so I know." "Isn't that enough, Cherry?" her mother said desperately. "No." said Cherry. I said I'd reach the toaster, and I'm going to reach the toaster. Her mother turned away to continue the drying up. Well, I can't spend all day on the beach today, Cherry, she said. If you haven't finished by the time we come away, I'll have to leave you there. We've got to pack up and tidy the house. There'll be no time in the morning. I'll be all right, said Cherry, cocking her head on one side to view the necklace from a different angle. There's never been a necklace like this before. Not in all the world, I'm sure there hasn't. And then, you can leave me there, Mum, and I'll walk back. It's only a mile or so along the cliff path and half a mile back across the fields. I've done it before on my own. It's not far. There was a thundering on the stairs and a sudden rude invasion of the kitchen. Cherry was surrounded by her 4 brothers who leant over the table in mock appreciation of her necklace. Oh, it's pretty. Do they come in other colours? I mean, pink's not my colour. Who's it for? An elephant? It's for a giant, said Cherry. It's a giant's necklace, and it's still not big enough. It was the perfect answer, an answer she knew would send her brothers into fits of laughter. She loved to make them laugh at her and could do it at the drop of a hat. Of course, she no more believed in giants than they did, but if it tickled them to believe she did, then why not pretend? She turned on them, fists flailed, and chased them back up the stairs, her eyes burning with fury. Just 'cause you don't believe in anything except motorbikes and football and all that rubbish, just 'cause you're great big fat ignorant pigs! She hurled insults up the stairs, and the worse the insult, the more they loved it. Boat Cove, just below Zena Head, was the beach they had found and occupied. I think they're real places in Cornwall. Every year, for as long as Cherry could remember, they had rented the same cottage set back in the fields below the Eagle's Nest, and every year they came to the same beach because no one else did. In 2 weeks, not another soul had ventured down the winding track through the bracken from the coastal path. It was a long climb down and a very much longer one up. The beach itself was almost hidden from the path that ran along the cliff top 100 feet away. It was private and perfect, and theirs. The boys swam in amongst the rocks, diving and snorkelling for hours on end. Her mother and father would sit side by side on stripy deck chairs, and she would read endlessly, and he would close his eyes against the sun and dream for hours on end. Hands up if you wish you were there right now. Cherry moved away from them and clambered over the rocks to a narrow strip of sand in the cove beyond the rocks, and here it was that she mined for the shells. In the gritty sand under the cliff face, she had found a particularly rich deposit. She was looking for pink cowrie shells. If you want to Google that, Cowrie, cowrie shells, of the same length, colour and shape, and that was what took the time. Occasionally, the boys would swim round the rocks and into her little beach, emerging from the sea all goggled and flippered to mock her. But as she paid them little attention, they soon tired and went away again. She knew time was running short. This was her very last chance to find enough shells to complete the giant's necklace, and it had to be done. The sea was calmer that day than she had ever seen it. The heat beat down from a windless, cloudless sky. Even the gulls and kittiwakes seemed to be silenced by the sun. Cherry searched on, stopping only for a picnic lunch of pasties and tomatoes with the family before returning at once to her shells. In the end, the heat proved too much for her mother and father, who left the beach earlier than usual, in mid-afternoon, to begin to tidy up the cottage. The boys soon followed because they had tired of finding miniature crabs and seaweed instead of the sunken wrecks and treasure that they had been seeking. So, by tea time, Cherry was left on her own on the beach, with strict instructions to keep her hat on, not to bathe alone, and to be back well before dark. She had calculated she needed 150 more shells, and so far she had only found 80. She would be back, she insisted, when she had finished collecting enough shells, and not before. Had she not been so immersed in her search, sifting the shells through her fingers, she would have noticed the dark grey bank of cloud rolling in from the Atlantic. She would have noticed the white horses gathering out at sea. What do they mean by that? The white horses gathering out at sea. Have a think. And the tide moving remorselessly in to cover the rocks between her and Boat Cove. When the clouds cut off the warmth from the sun as evening came on, and the sea turned grey, she shivered with cold and put on her sweater and jeans. She did look up then and saw the angry sea, but she saw no threat in that, and did not look back over her shoulder to Boat Cove. She was aware that time was running out, so she went down on her knees again and dug feverishly in the sand. She had to collect 30 more shells. It was the baleful sound of the foghorn somewhere out at sea, beyond Gunnard's Head, that at last forced Cherry to take some account of the incoming tide. She looked for the rocks she would have to clamber over to reach Beach Cove again, and the winding track that would take her up to the cliff path and safety, but they were gone. Where they should have been, the sea was already driving in against the cliff face. She was cut off. In a confusion of wonder and fear, she looked out to sea, at the heaving ocean that moved in towards her, seeing it now as a writhing grey monster, breathing its fury on the rocks with every pounding wave. Still, Cherry did not forget her shells, but wrapping them inside her towel, she tucked them into her sweater and waded out towards the surf, towards the rocks. If she timed it right, she reasoned, she could scramble back over them and into the cove as the surf went back again. She reached the first of the rocks without too much difficulty. The sea here seemed to be protected from the force of the ocean by the rocks further out. Holding fast to the first rock, she came to, and with the sea up around her waist, she waited for the next incoming wave to break and retreat. The wave was unexpectedly impotent and fell limply on the rocks around her. She knew her moment had come and took it. She was not to know that piling up far out at sea was the first of the giant storm waves that had gathered several hundred miles out in the ocean, bringing with it all the momentum and violence of the Atlantic. The rocks were slippery underfoot, and more than once Cherry slipped down into seething white rock pools where she had played so often when the tide was out. But she struggled on until, finally, she had climbed high enough to be able to see the thin strip of land that was all that was left of Boat Cove. It was only a few yards away and so close. Until now, she had been crying involuntarily, but now, as she recognised the little path up through the bracken, her heart was lifted with hope and anticipation. She knew that the worst was over, that if the sea would only hold back, she would reach the sanctuary of the cove. She turned and looked behind her to see how far away the next wave was, just to reassure herself that she had enough time. But the great surge of green water was on her before she could register either disappointment or fear, and she was hurled back against the rock below her and covered at once by the sea. She was conscious as she went down that she was drowning, but she still clutched her shells against her chest and hoped she had enough of them at last to finish the giant's necklace. Those were her last thoughts before the sea took her away. Cherry lay on her side, where the tide had lifted her, and coughed until her lungs were clear. She woke as the sea came in once again and frothed around her legs. She rolled on her back, feeling the salt spray on her face, and saw that it was night time. The sky above her was dashed with stars, and the moon rode through the clouds. Sorry about that. The sky above her was dashed with stars, and the moon rode through the clouds. She scrambled to her feet, one hand still holding her precious shells close to her. Instinctively, she backed away from the sea and looked around her. With growing dismay, she saw that she had been thrown back on the wrong side of the rocks, and that she was not in Boat Cove. The tide had left only a few feet of sand and rock between her and the cliff face. There was no way back through the sea to safety. She turned round to face the cliff that she realised now would be her last hope, for she remembered that this little beach vanished completely at high tide. If she stayed where she was, she would surely be swept away again, and this time she might not be so fortunate. But the cold seemed to have calmed her, and she reasoned more deliberately now, wondering why she had not tried climbing the cliff before. She had hurried into her first attempt at escape, and it had very nearly cost her her life. She would wait this time until the sea forced her up the cliff. Perhaps the tide would not come in that far. Perhaps they would be looking for her by now. It was dark. Surely they would be searching. Surely they must find her soon. After all, they knew where she was. Yes, she thought, best just to wait and hope. She settled down on a ledge of rock that was the first step up onto the cliff face, drew her knees up to her chin to keep out the chill, and waited. She watched as the sea crept ever closer, each wave lashing her with spray and eating away gradually at the beach. She closed her eyes and prayed, hoping against hope that when she opened them the sea would be retreating. But her prayers went unanswered, and the sea came in to cover the beach. Once or twice she thought she heard voices above her on the cliff path, but when she called out, no one came. She continued to shout for help every few minutes, forgetting it was futile against the continuous roar and hiss of the waves. A pair of raucous white gulls flew down from the cliffs to investigate her, and she called to them for help, but they did not seem to understand, and they wheeled away into the night. Cherry stayed sitting on her rock until the waves threatened to dislodge her, and then, reluctantly, she began to climb. She would go as far as she needed to and no further. She had scanned the first few feet above for footholds, and it did look quite a simple climb to begin with, and so it proved. But her hands were numbed with cold, and her legs began to tremble, and but her hands were numbed with cold, and her legs began to tremble with the strain almost at once. She could see that the ledge she had now reached was the last deep one visible on the cliff face. The shells in her sweater were restricting her freedom of movement, so she decided she would leave them there. Wrapped tight in the towel, they should be safe. She took the soaking bundle out of her sweater and placed it carefully against the rock face on the ledge beside her, pushing it as far as it would go. "I'll be back for you," she said, and reached up for the next lip of rock. Just below her, the sea crashed against the cliff, as if it wanted to suck her from the rock face and claim her once again. Cherry determined not to look down, but to concentrate on the climb. At first, she imagined that the glow above her was from a torch. She shouted and screamed until she was weak from the effort of it, and although no answering call came from the night, the light remained pale and beckoning, wider than that of a torch. With renewed hope, Cherry found enough strength to inch her way up the cliff until she reached the entrance to a narrow cave. It was filled with a flickering yellow light, like that of a candle shaken by the wind. She hauled herself into the mouth of the cave and sat down exhausted, looking back down at the furious sea frothing beneath her. She laughed aloud in triumph. She was safe. She had defied the sea, and she had won. Her one regret was that she had had to leave her cowrie shells behind. She would fetch them tomorrow after the tide had gone down again. For the first time now, she began to think of her family and how worried they would be. But the thought of walking in through the front door, all dripping and dramatic, made her almost choke with excitement. As she reached forward to brush a sharp stone from the sole of her foot, Cherry noticed that the narrow entrance to the cave was half sealed in. She ran her fingers over the stones and cement to make sure, for the light was poor. It was at that moment that she recognised exactly where she was. She recalled now the giant fledgling cuckoo one of her brothers had spotted being fed by a tiny rock pipit, earlier in the holidays. How they had quarrelled over the binoculars, and how, when she had finally usurped them and made her escape across the rocks, she had found the cuckoo perched at the entrance to a narrow cave some way up the cliff face from the beach. She had asked about the man-made walling, and her father had told her of the old tin mines, whose lodes and adits crisscrossed the entire coastal area around Zennor. This one, he said, might have been the mine they called Wheel North Grills, and he thought the adit must have been walled up to prevent the seas from entering the mine in a storm. It was said there had been an accident in the mine only a few years after it was opened, over 100 years before, and that the mine had had to close soon after when the mine owners ran out of money to make the necessary repairs. The entire story came back to her now, and as she wondered where the cuckoo was and whether the rock pit had died with the effort of keeping the fledgling alive. Tin mines, she thought, led to the surface and the way home. That thought and her natural inquisitiveness about the source of light persuaded her to her feet, and she walked into the tunnel. And I think we shall leave it there for now. It's only a short story, so we're halfway through it already, which means that Mrs. Brazier will probably finish it off tomorrow, and then we can start something new again. I hope you're all well, and I know this heat is horrible, but try and be kind to each other, because the heat doesn't do great things for us on the whole. So be kind, wash your hands, blah, blah, blah. Stay safe, stay alert. Very important.